Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and welcome to CABE 2021. My name is Jan Caslon, CEO of CABE. On behalf of our CABE Board of Directors, our amazing team, our CABE community, it is so good to see you all today, to be connected via Zoom and feel the presence and embrace of the CABE community. What a joy to come together as we celebrate the empowerment of being multilingual. And in honor of our commitment to multilingualism, we are providing interpretation today in both Spanish and Korean. So if you would like to hear today's presentation in either Spanish or Korean, please select that language at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom control panel, and you'll be able to hear the presentations today in either Spanish or Korean. Thank you so much. It has been quite a year that we have all been through, but today we are ready to begin a wonderful week full of learning, whether we are in distance, hybrid, or in-person learning. We also start today by standing in solidarity with our Asian community, our Black brothers and sisters in times of tremendous racial injustice and tension, and sadly, the victims from the shooting in Boulder, Colorado yesterday. As we start today, I would just like us to take a brief moment of silence to remember the lives that have been impacted by this violence and to recommit ourselves to being part of the change that will be required. Let's take a brief moment of silence. This will be a week where we can reconnect, we can strategize, we can talk, dialogue, heal, and learn together. We are here for each other, and together we are CABE Strong. So now, as we get ready to begin, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our CABE Board President, Olivia Yaya. Welcome, Olivia.
Thank you, Jan, and good afternoon to all. Buenas tardes. It gives me such great pleasure to welcome you all to the 46th Annual Conference of the California Association for Bilingual Education and to our very first virtual conference. As your CABE Board President, I couldn't be prouder of the leadership and teamwork across the state that has made this conference possible. While the setting might be different, I can already feel the CABE love and community across our networks and Zoom accounts. It's contagious, and today I'm just so honored that our conference is standing together for unity, multiliteracy, and equity. And it intentionally was chosen to convey a sense of empowerment and connectedness during a year of challenging, stretching, and truly unimaginable experiences. Yet, here we are, standing stronger together, celebrating our rich language and cultural backgrounds, and ready for deep learning and dialogues regarding language, multiculturalism, and equity in our schools and communities. It will be a week of innovative ideas, fun connections, motivational speakers, and even our traditional CABE dance on Friday evening. I hope you have begun to find your way around the CABE 2021 portal. You truly can find everything there, and our CABE team is available there and ready to help you. Just need to have a little click. I am sure you noticed that our conference days and session times are shorter to maximize our learning while controlling our screen time, but our speakers and sessions are more dynamic than ever. Set your alarms to join CABE each day between 2 and 3 for an afternoon of incredible learning opportunities. Will be done by 7 p.m. so you'll have time with your families and to get ready for the next day. On Saturday, we will be together from 8 to 1. For me, CABE is always about staying current and connected, learning the best skills and strategies to take back to our school sites and districts, and hearing the best presentations from educational leaders nationwide. And who better than our very own new U.S. Secretary of Education, Dr. Miguel Cardona, to kick us off with a special greeting. Join me in welcoming Dr. Miguel Cardona. Bienvenido.
I'm Miguel Cardona, U.S. Secretary of Education. I'm proud to say I began my educational journey as an English learner in Meriden, Connecticut. I had the support of my family and a strong emphasis on retaining my native language, Spanish. Later, as an educator and former school principal serving hundreds of bilingual students, I emphasized the importance of maintaining native language and culture. I know firsthand the importance of your work. The evidence supporting bilingual education isn't just anecdotal, it's well documented. Knowing more than one language from birth, acquiring a new language through school, or learning languages later in life offers real advantages in many areas. From delaying cognitive signs of aging, to earning college credits and expanding career opportunities, multilingualism is an asset that benefits English learners as well as native English speakers. Bilingual students bring rich and diverse perspectives to our classrooms and our communities. Perspectives that promote open dialogue, increase collaboration and cultural competencies, and improve learning for all students. And in our global economy, these skills contribute to America's prosperity, giving us more ways to compete and to cooperate at home and abroad. I'm excited that the work to improve outcomes for English learners is well underway in California. Your state's English learner roadmap can inspire states nationwide as we all work toward ensuring that all students learn in environments where they are welcomed, understood, and valued. This work is especially important now. While during COVID, English learners have faced unique challenges with remote learning, causing some to fall further behind, many of the barriers they face are not new. Far too many teachers still feel unprepared to work with English learners and struggle to promote their success. Some schools lack the resources and facilities to adequately support English learners. This administration is committed to advancing your efforts, from investments through the American Rescue Plan to advancing educational excellence and equity, including expanded access to an effective, diverse teaching profession. For me, education was the great equalizer, and it can be for all students. We can start by improving opportunities for all English learners. We must have an ambitious vision for English learners across the nation. It will take a sustained focus and a sense of urgency from leaders at the school, the district, state, and at the federal level to move English learners as far as possible, as quickly as possible, on a trajectory toward success. But it can and it must be done. Together, we can replicate promising practices like providing support in a student's native language, developing strong dual language programs, and providing the necessary accommodations to increase access and opportunity for English learners. When we value cultural and linguistic diversity in our classrooms and help English learners reach their potential, we all benefit. From individual students to whole communities. Maybe some of you have heard this proverb: to learn a language is to have one more window to look at the world. In Spanish, we would say, aprender un idioma es tener una ventana más para mirar el mundo. You help your students have wide views, open hearts, and broad roads to success. Thank you for the work you do on behalf of English learners and all bilingual, multilingual, and multicultural students. I look forward to our continued work together. Siempre pa'lante.
Thank you so very much, Secretary Cardona, for that inspiring message. We look forward to collaborating with you in your new position. Now, from one great leader to the next, join me in welcoming Superintendent of the San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools, Ted Alejandre. Welcome, Superintendent Alejandre.
Hello, I am Ted Alejandre, the San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools. As an honorary chairman, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the California Association of Bilingual Educators 2021 Virtual Annual Conference. I want to thank you for your attendance and support of CABE as they promote bilingual programs and quality educational experiences for all students in California. CABE's work is far-reaching and only possible with the support of dedicated teachers and administrators like you. Thank you for your commitment to create enriching and equitable learning experiences for every student. The conference theme illustrates CABE's missions and goals, standing together for unity, multiliteracy, and equity. They are dedicated to engaging and empowering non-English speaking parents so they can support their children in the classroom and beyond. San Bernardino County recently organized a local CABE chapter to engage our community with all of its diverse cultural, racial, and linguistic backgrounds. The group is off to a great start, strengthening multilingual programs in our area. It is absolutely a privilege to be a longtime CABE member and to be here with you today. I want to express my appreciation to the Planning Committee, presenters, and sponsors for organizing such a fantastic event. I'm thankful to be your partner in creating transformative learning experiences for every student.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Alejandro, for your leadership and partnership. Every year, the CABE board honors different individuals or organizations for special awards. This year, the board is very proud to honor two very special individuals with the CABE Board Award for Legacy, Dr. Jim Cummins and Dr. Steve Frashen. The collective impact of their work over many decades has shaped the development of bilingual programs across our state, nation, and the world. I invite you to join me and CABE board members today at 5:40 to honor them in a special award spotlight session and for an opportunity to hear from each of these education giants. Look for the special session in the workshop listings for the CABE 2021 portal. I hope truly that you will join us there. And now, it gives me great honor to introduce you to our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Jim Cummins. Jim has been a friend and impactful educational researcher and leader almost since the very beginning of CABE. He is a professor emeritus of the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education of the University of Toronto, and his research has focused on the nature of language proficiency and second language acquisition, emphasizing the social and educational barriers that limit academic success for culturally diverse students. He has served as a consultant on language publications, agencies, and his publications are many. Today, we are fortunate to welcome Rebecca Field from Caslon Publishing, who is a CABE 2021 Gold Level sponsor, to introduce Jim to all of us. Welcome, Rebecca, and thank you for Caslon's partnership with and sponsorship of CABE 2021.
Thank you very much, Olivia. I'm very happy to be here today to introduce Dr. Jim Cummins. He's from the University of Toronto. Many of you may know him, and he's been making powerful contributions in the field for decades now. I've known Jim for my entire professional career, and one of the things that I know and love about Jim is that he's always everywhere. Sometimes he's developing, interrogating, and critiquing theories about academic language, about dual language learning, about identity texts. Sometimes he's working with principals and superintendents on restructuring schools with particular attention to teacher agency and teacher as decision makers. Still other times you might be working in the classroom with teachers and having them come together to figure out how they can draw on the particular language resources and cultural resources that their students bring with them to the classroom. Whatever he's doing, one of the great things I love is that Jim is always first and foremost about teaching and learning the students and the teachers in the classroom. Without further ado, I give you Jim Cummins. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be back here at the CABE conference. It's a pleasure to meet friends that I've known for quite a number of years. Rebecca and I have presented together many, many years ago, and we have enjoyed our time in terms of exploring these issues. And so it's a real pleasure to be back at the CABE conference. I'd also like to express my appreciation to CABE for the Legacy Award that they have so generously conferred on me and Steve Krashen. It brings me back to the many, many years that I've worked with CABE. CABE have published a number of books that I've written, and they have done amazing work over the past 40 or so years. If I had an award to make, if I had the power to make awards, I would certainly award CABE the Impact Award, because the positive effect that CABE has had on the lives of children, on the lives of teachers, and on the society in general, not just in California, but across the United States and internationally, has been huge. And it's a real privilege to have been a little part of that process. So I'll go to my screen at this point. On the screen, you can see a bulletin board from one of the classrooms that colleagues of mine and I worked in over 15 years ago. And the teachers in these classrooms were opening up the space, or trying to open up the space to engage students in talking about their own languages. These were highly multilingual classrooms. There were numerous languages represented in each one. And so they weren't bilingual programs because of the number of languages there. But lots of really interesting things happened when teachers started to talk about their own language learning experiences, the languages they knew, how they'd learned them. And students, sometimes reluctantly at first, but when they felt safe doing it, they started to talk about their own languages and they wrote about them. And this poster that you see on your screen was one where the students had talked about all of the languages in their school and in their classroom, and they'd written about the languages that they knew. They'd talked to their parents about them, etc. And this is an example of what I'll call engaging students' multilingual repertoires. It's also been called translanguaging pedagogy, which I'll also talk about. But it highlights the fact that in our instruction, if we don't connect the curriculum with students' lives, we're probably not going to be successful. And so what I want to focus on are, like, what does research say about effective instructional strategies for multilingual students? And what does this imply for whole school strategies, as well as classroom-based strategies that individual teachers will implement in their classrooms? So the overview identifies three different parts of what I'm going to say. I'm going to initially talk about 4 sets of research findings and theoretical principles that I think are crucial to understanding academic language development among multilingual students. And a number of these findings go back 40 years or so. I was with Steve Krashen and a number of other authors. I was one of the people who contributed to the California Theoretical Framework for Educating Language Minority Students that was published in 1981 by the State Department. And some of these findings that I'll talk about were in my chapter in that book. So we're not talking about anything new here, but obviously these things need to get said over and over again, because policymakers in many cases have not internalized the implications of what the research and theory is saying. Then the second part is one where I'll look at a framework for identifying evidence-based instructional responses to what some people have called the opportunity gaps faced by minoritized students. And I'll explain what I mean by that later on. And then I'll end up with looking at how do we work with our colleagues in our schools to develop strategies for whole school collaboration to promote academic achievement among minoritized students. Okay, so the first of the four theoretical principles or theoretical frames that I want to look at involves looking at the way in which what happens in schools is embedded in a pattern of societal power relations. Everything that we do in schools connects up with the society that funds our schools. And as we know, societies around the world are characterized by different kinds of power relations where some groups have less power, some groups have more power. Most societies have a history of discrimination against certain racialized and minoritized groups. And schools reflect the societies that they're in. And so historically, these power relations have played themselves out within schools in some obvious ways. And so what this framework is designed to highlight is the fact that if we're going to create environments where students will learn effectively and develop powerful ways of using languages, teachers have to actively challenge the ways power relations operate within schools. And so the framework here is looking at the ways in which patterns of power relations in the broader society influence the ways in which educators define their roles, or what we can think of as teacher identity, how we answer the question on a Monday morning when we walk into our classrooms and say, what am I doing here? That's a serious question, and we should know what we're doing here. But power relations will also influence the structures of schooling, the way in which curriculum is organized, whose values, whose knowledge are reflected in the curriculum, who gets more funding, who gets less, the kinds of assessments that are orchestrated within our society and schools, etc. So all of these things then influence the patterns of interaction that occur in classrooms between teachers and linguistically and culturally diverse students. And these interactions form what I'm calling an interpersonal space within which learning happens, hopefully, and identities are negotiated. And then these identity negotiations either reinforce what I've called coercive relations of power, or they promote collaborative relations of power. This framework was initially published in a book that CABE published in 1996 called Negotiating Identities, Education for Empowerment in a Diverse Society. And so these ideas were developed in collaboration with teachers and administrators and scholars in the California context. And so when we look at the sources of potential discrimination that are operating in the broader society, one of them concerns stereotypes about different groups of students. And there's a phenomenon that's been demonstrated over and over again by psychologists in the laboratory that they call stereotype threat, which shows that students or individuals' task performance deteriorates when negative stereotypes are communicated to them. And all of these sources of potential disadvantage basically boil down to low teacher expectations and a broader pattern of devaluation of identity, reflecting coercive relations of power in the broader society. I think nobody said it more succinctly than Gloria Ladson-Billings, who, as many of you know, is a very eminent African-American researcher in the United States. She said in one of her articles published quite a while ago, she said that the problem that African-American students face is the constant devaluation of their culture, both in school and in the larger society. And so if that devaluation is happening in the wider society, then what schools have to do is challenge that devaluation by affirming students' identities. And I'll give you some examples of how that can happen. If we move to the second point that I want to make, and that concerns the nature of language proficiency. And I've made a distinction that I originally called basic interpersonal communicative skills, or BICS, and CALP, cognitive academic language proficiency. I use those acronyms interchangeably with the terms conversational fluency and academic language proficiency. And so, as all of us know, when we're talking face-to-face in a casual way with friends in an everyday context, we're relaxed. We're using a certain kind of language. We're using low frequency words. We're not using complex grammatical constructions. It's a very different kind of language than the language we tend to use in school context, or we need to get our students to learn in school contexts. There's a lot of the meaning communicated by facial expressions, by the immediate context, by gestures, eye contact, etc. And so what we're talking about is the kind of language that's developed by the vast majority of native speakers of any language by the time they enter school at around age 5. And students who are learning the school language, students who speak a language other than the school language at home, typically pick up a considerable degree of comfort within usually about a year, sometimes a little bit longer. And in everyday contexts, they can function pretty well. But we know from a lot of research that it takes a lot longer to catch up academically. We're looking at typically at least 5 years, sometimes much longer for students. And that's because the kind of language that students are required to understand and use within school includes knowledge of less frequent vocabulary, as well as the ability to interpret and produce increasingly complex written language. The language that you find in children's books and in curriculum at grade 1 is very different than the language you find at grade 12. It gets more and more complex as students go through the grades. Linguists have highlighted the fact that this language often involves frequent use of the passive voice as opposed to the active voice, and then structures like nominalization, where we make an abstract noun out of a verb or sometimes an adjective. And these kinds of terms are rarely used in conversation because they're relatively low frequency. When we talk, for example, about acceleration, if we were talking in an everyday context, we might say going faster. And an important point is the third point that's here. Because academic language is found primarily in books and in printed texts, extensive reading is crucial in enabling students to catch up. And I'll elaborate on that in a moment. But just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about when I talk about academic language, I pulled these vocabulary items, these words, from a grade 5 social studies unit on the American Revolution. And so think about the last time you ever used a word like amend, or perpetual, or sentiments, or inference. You might have used some of these words in classrooms, but these are not the words that we use with our friends. These are not the words that we use on Facebook. If you use this kind of language on Facebook, you will be defriended very, very quickly. There's a big difference. There's a conceptual distinction that can be made between the kind of language that students are required to learn within schools and the kind that all of us use in everyday contexts outside of schools. And we all know this. One of the reasons we take 5-year-old kids and who are totally fluent in their language, they've acquired native speaker competence in their language, and we spend another 12 years teaching them language arts, or what we call language arts. It's because in contexts that are required by many jobs, in contexts that are required to function in society, to do our taxes, for example, we need to have a much more sophisticated knowledge of the language than we get in everyday communication. The third point that I want to make in kind of bringing together some of the core research findings and theoretical ideas that we need to be aware of when we talk about language change or language policy within our schools is what I've called a common underlying proficiency model. And this reflects the empirical basis for teaching for cross-linguistic transfer. I've used a metaphor, an iceberg metaphor, which I borrowed from a sociolinguist called Roger Shai. In fact, this happened on one of the first trips I made to California back in 1979. Roger and I and a couple of other people were presenting on a panel at a conference. And Roger had developed this metaphor of looking at language proficiency as an iceberg, where, as we know, what we see above the surface with icebergs is only a small fraction of the mass, the volume that's below the surface. And Roger made the point that language proficiency is kind of like that. What's more fundamental for academic achievement is what's not very obvious in everyday interactions with students. And then I've been talking about interdependence across languages, and it occurred to me in talking with Roger Shai that we could think of bilingual proficiency as a double iceberg, where even though the surface features of the two languages are different, at a deeper level, the level that we don't see very obviously, there's a lot of overlap or interdependence across languages. So in other words, although languages can be distinguished in our cognitive system, we know, for example, that when unfortunate people who get aphasia, that affects their competence and their ability to use different languages differently. When people are going through the process of dementia, often languages they've acquired most recently are the first to go. And so we know that languages have real existence in our heads, but there's also a dynamic interrelationship across languages. And this allows us to teach for transfer across languages, and it's a crucial notion in terms of translanguaging theory, that we teach for transfer across languages. And what this means in concrete terms is that the languages that students are bringing into the classroom are not irrelevant. They're not an impediment to students' learning of the school language. They're not an impediment to doing well at school. In fact, they're the foundation upon which we build strong academic proficiency in the school language and strong literacy skills, ideally in both languages. There's a really useful visual metaphor that was suggested by a PhD student from New Zealand, a person called Sophie Tawea Tamati, in her dissertation, which she wrote in 2016 at the University of Auckland. And she elaborated the notion of the common underlying proficiency in terms of this tree, the kahikatea tree, that grows in New Zealand. It grows in swampy areas. And in order to increase the strength of the trees, the roots spread out and they intertwine with each other. So it's characterized by a network of entangled roots that bind multiple trees together, thereby enhancing the strength of each individual tree. And Sophie's idea is that our languages are represented in our brains in a similar way. Even though we can distinguish individual trees, like languages exist, at a deeper level, there's a lot of interdependence, overlap, dynamic connections across languages. And it seems to me that that's a much more kind of visceral and dynamic metaphor for what's happening than the kind of more sketchy dual language iceberg idea that I came up with quite a few years ago, but they're both essentially saying the same thing. So let's look at what this might mean in an actual classroom setting. These examples come from a book that Margaret Early and I edited about 10 years ago. And these were reflections of students who were learners of English. They wrote these, I think, after their first year of learning English. They were in an ESL class, and the teacher was Lisa Leone, a brilliant, inspirational teacher from whom I've learned an enormous amount. And Lisa consistently encouraged her students to carry out creative writing and other assignments in their home languages, and to generally use their home languages as a stepping stone to English. There were multiple languages represented in her classrooms. But if you listen to the students, you can see just how that interdependence across languages works. So what Amina says is, when I'm allowed to use my first language in class, it helps me with my writing and reading of English. Because if I translation in English to Urdu, then Urdu give me help for English language. I also think better and write more in English when I use Urdu, because I can see in Urdu what I want to say in English. So clearly these languages have cognitive reality for Amina. And she's talking about the ways in which the two languages reinforce each other and help each other. It's very clear that they see the connections across languages. They're actively looking for transfer. And because the teacher has opened up the space to allow them to use their first language or encourage them to use their first language, this process can take place much more effectively than if the classroom is implicitly or explicitly an English-only zone. The last point that I want to make in terms of background ideas is the fact that the notion of additive or what could be seen as active bilingualism is an important one to keep in mind. There's a lot of research out there that's been there for almost 50 years at this point, showing that when students continue to develop both their languages, when they develop literacy in both their languages, there are linguistic, there are cognitive, and personal benefits associated with that. I pulled out a quotation from Sonia Nieto and Patty Bode. They're authors of a book that some of you may be familiar with, the Affirming Diversity book, which is probably the most widely used textbook in terms of multicultural education, critical pedagogy, etc. And they define additive and subtractive bilingualism in the following way. Additive bilingualism refers to a framework for understanding language acquisition and development that adds a new language rather than subtracts an existing one. This perspective is radically different from the traditional expectation in our society that immigrants shed their native language as they learn the new language English. Additive bilingualism supports the notion that two is better than one, that English plus other languages can make us stronger individually and as a society. So basically, what we're talking about with the notion of additive bilingualism is challenging coercive relations of power, challenging the mindset that for many years was characteristic of schools in the United States, in Canada, and many other countries, that students should give up their first language in order to learn the second language effectively. Parents should stop speaking Spanish or Urdu or Hindi or whatever their home language is to the students, because if they continue to use that language at home, it's going to hurt their students' chances in school. Nothing could be further from the truth. We need to work with parents and we need to work in our own classrooms to communicate to students the huge value, cognitively, educationally, personally, that continued development of both languages represents. And this can happen not only in bilingual programs or dual language programs, but also in programs where the medium of instruction is through English. And the work that Ophelia Garcia and her colleagues in New York have carried out on translanguaging is inspirational in this respect. They've produced a wide variety of resources that are freely available on the web that I'd encourage everybody to check out. Okay, so that's what I wanted to cover in part one. Basically, here are some core ideas that we need to be familiar with if we're going to develop a school-based language policy that's coherent and where what students are, the messages that students are getting in one class reinforces what they're going to hear when they go on to the next class. So the second part consists just of this one slide or one or two slides. And basically it says, like, if we're going to think about improving our schools, if we're going to think about reversing underachievement, logically, the first question we've got to ask is, well, who are the students who are underachieving? And obviously many students who have special needs will underachieve, and I'm not considering those students within this. But when we look at the categories or the groups of students that internationally tend to experience disproportionate underachievement and higher dropout rates, etc., there are three groups. There are students from linguistically diverse backgrounds. Some of them may be immigrant students who are born outside the United States. Others may be from immigrant backgrounds, but born in the United States or other countries. And then there are students who are coming from socially disadvantaged backgrounds or low socioeconomic status backgrounds, where the families may be living in poverty or close to poverty, and there are many consequences of that that researchers have highlighted. And then the third group are students from racialized or marginalized groups who have experienced the effects of societal discrimination, often low teacher expectations, stereotype threat, stigmatization of their the home language varieties that they bring to school, and a broad pattern of identity devaluation. So if we look at those three groups as experiencing what a number of researchers have called opportunity gaps, then we can ask, like, what do we know about what schools can do to address these opportunity gaps? So if we look at students from linguistically diverse backgrounds, the obvious risk factor is that they're coming to school with no or minimal knowledge of the school language. And obviously, if the school does nothing to help them, they're going to have a lot more difficulty than if the school provides a context or the support that will help them to acquire the language. So the evidence-based instructional responses that have emerged from the research literature is that teachers need to know how to scaffold comprehension and production of language right across the curriculum. The key point here is it's not just the ESL teacher or the bilingual teacher, the language specialist who needs to know how to do this. All teachers need to know how to do it. Secondly, we need to engage students' multilingual repertoires. If the classroom is an English-only zone, we're cutting off a lot of students' cognitive power. And thirdly, if we understand the nature of academic language and the challenges for all students, not just second language learners, but all students in developing strong academic language, we need to be reinforcing academic language knowledge across the curriculum. So when we're teaching science, we're not just teaching science as a content area, we're teaching the language of science. When we're teaching math, we're not just teaching students how to do calculations, we're teaching them how to understand word problems and the language that those mathematical problems are couched in. And so that means that we need to be conscious of identifying not just content objectives, but language objectives as we try and build up students' awareness of how academic language works. But there is one thing that we can do that is hugely impactful. A lot of research has identified the fact that students who are growing up in poverty environments and low-income environments tend to have much less access to print, to books, for example, both in their homes and often in the schools that serve them. There are often very few libraries in low-income areas, and those that are tend to be much less well stocked with books for children and books in multiple languages in schools than libraries in more affluent areas. The research suggests that if we can maximize the literacy engagement, the print access and literacy engagement that students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds experience when they're coming into the school, we can push back a significant part of the impact of the negative impact of low socioeconomic status. In fact, involving hundreds of thousands of students carried out, gathered internationally, suggests that we could push back about 1/3 of the negative effects of social disadvantage if we were to get students actively engaged with literacy from a very early stage. That's a huge impact. And yet we're still caught up with sort of useless dichotomies about whether we should be teaching phonics versus whole language. We need to get students decoding, obviously, but decoding is not going to get students very far in reading comprehension. They need to be expanding their vocabulary. They need to be becoming aware of how the language of print works. And they do that by reading and by getting involved in a collaborative process with their peers where books become an important part of their lives and they're talking about books and discussing books. And again, with students from low-income backgrounds, it's crucial to reinforce academic language across the curriculum. If we move to the third category, if identity devaluation is a core underlying feature of students who tend not to do well in school because their identities are being devalued, their community's identities are being devalued in the wider society, and the school is doing very little to challenge that devaluation, then underachievement will continue. But if we connect instruction to students' lives, if we adjust the curriculum to make the ideas and the content relevant to students' background interests. If we think about the kind of colonial type experience that many minoritized students have experienced, or many minoritized communities have experienced, often over generations, and then we need to challenge that process of devaluation that's associated with what some people have called internal colonies. And there's well-documented strategies for doing this through culturally sustaining pedagogy, or what some people call critical pedagogies or transformative pedagogies. We need to valorize and build on the language varieties that students bring to school. And what this boils down to is a whole focus within the school on creating learning environments where students' identities are being affirmed. And their identities will be affirmed when they are enabled to use language in powerful ways. So the point of this framework, and I would see this framework as a starting point for discussion amongst teachers within schools. The point of it is that we need to bring these three things together. Let me give you an example of dual language text experience that shows how all of these things can be brought together when in one instructional intervention. Tomer was a grade 6 student. He arrived in grade 6 to a school in the Toronto area. He arrived from Israel, and he'd grown up in an agricultural context. He didn't know any English or minimal English when he came to Canada. Again, this was a student who was in the same teacher, Lisa Leone's class. And as I said, Lisa encouraged her students to write in their first language as well as in English. And Tomer wrote a story initially in Hebrew. And there was a teacher in the school who knew enough Hebrew to help him translate it from Hebrew into English. And the result is this dual language book that was put up on the web. It's been read by thousands of people. And Tomer had, I think, some really important insights about how powerful this process was. He said, I think using your first language is so helpful, because when you don't understand something after you've just come here, it's like beginning as a baby. You know, he very clearly identifies the fact that his identity is jeopardized when he's made incapable by the fact that he can't use his first language, or if you were in the classroom where that was the case. He says, you don't know English and you need to learn it all from the beginning. But if you already have it in another language, then it's easier. You can translate it and you can do it in your language too. And then it's easier to understand the second language. This is the common underlying proficiency notion, the interdependence, the fact that we can transfer knowledge across languages. He goes on to say, the first time I couldn't understand what his teacher Lisa was saying, except the word Hebrew. But I think it's very smart that she said for us to do it in our language, because we can't just sit on our hands doing nothing. And so when we look at this, what we see here is that Tomer is clearly identifying the existential reality of language and languages. Languages exist for him in his brain. And because languages exist, he can transfer across languages. He can scaffold his second language, academic language learning, through his first language writing. If you had given Tomer the English version of his book before he had written it, he would not have been able to read it. But after he had written it, he could read it. Now that sounds paradoxical, but that's exactly what's happening here. Because in going from his first language to English, he learned a huge amount of English. All of the language that he had written about in Hebrew, he was able to internalize and learn in English as a result of this. Obviously, this is an example of literacy engagement. We see connecting instruction to students' lives, and obviously identity affirmation is powerfully present in all of this. So when you think back to the instructional strategies in the previous slide, the framework, a lot of these things come together in instruction when we're doing it right. Okay, my last slide is just a template that some teachers have found useful in thinking about and discussing how we can create language and instructional strategies or plans that can move our school in the direction of school improvement. So I've listed a number of instructional options there, such as literacy engagement, content, how can we adapt curriculum materials to link with students' existing knowledge and cultural background? How can we scaffold their knowledge of this? How can we ensure that students are using all of their brains, all of their cognitive power in learning? And this is a theme that comes up a lot. Tomer said we can't just sit in our hands doing nothing. But unfortunately, in the era when teachers were not familiar with scaffolding strategies, they would often just have students do things like color, do low-level cognitive tasks, because they figured, well, they don't know the language, so they can't really do anything very challenging. And that's nonsense. And we can look at then at how we can use various kinds of technological tools to enhance instruction. We can think about assessment. We can look at students' language and culture. Like, what is the implicit message that students get in our classrooms? Do they see, when they look up on the wall, do they see that kind of invisible or barely visible sign up there saying English only zone, where they have internalized the notion that school is a place where only English is permissible and they've got to leave their languages at the schoolhouse door? Or is it a translanguaging classroom where students' languages are encouraged, shared, and seen as a foundation for further academic development? These are strategies that teachers in Sanchez School, where my friend and colleague Raymond Isola was principal for 13 years, they adopted a lot of these strategies in looking at ways in which they could transform the instruction in the school. And this is a book that Raymond and I wrote based on that experience. Anyway, I will stop there. And again, I want to express my appreciation to CABE for the opportunity to be with you, even in a virtual way, during this conference. And I hope in future years that we'll be able to get together again in real face-to-face situations and share ideas and renew friendships. So thank you.